Okay, this topic we're talking to Dan McQuillan about his work resisting AI. Thanks for joining us, Dan. Can
Yeah, you're
you
welcome.
can you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do these days?
Yeah, well, I mean, these days I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer, senior lecturer in critical AI now.
Yeah.
Sign of the times. I originally did a PhD in experimental particle physics, but in the time between those two things, I did. I worked with people with learning disabilities, people with mental health problems. I worked for Amnesty for a while. I worked in the NHS, which is the UK health service. So yeah, I've done a variety of things.
Yep.
But now I mainly complain about AI.
So tell me a little about your research, in terms of what you've been doing the last few years and your book.
Yeah, well, I was kind of I'm not sure if fortunate's the right word, but I happened to have, different experiences that allowed me to sort of look at AI when it was emerging. I had some technical background, a science background, programming background. I work in the School of Computing, but I also had experience of social movements. I had experience of, human rights. I had experience of a variety of areas that just sort of converged that when I looked at AI as it was emerging, basically made me very alarmed. How
Yeah.
I could immediately see what I thought were some of the inevitable social consequences of this if nothing changed, and
Yep.
unfortunately a lot of which come to pass.
It has. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Okay, so let's go through some of the material. So what I've done for the material this week, I've used um, the kind of text from a performance he did, which is I think a photo of it there. So
Yeah.
and I'm hoping students will read through this because I think it's really evocative to read. But we'll just kind of use these for you to kind of tell us some aspects of the different things you think about the topic. So yeah, can you begin with
Yeah.
like tell us a little bit about the operations of AI?
Yeah, well, I do think the operations of AI are important. Some people now say, oh, well, people talk about AI, they mean anything they want. When I talk about AI, I do mean a specific technology, which is the one that's being rolled out. I mean, the one you've probably got in your pocket. It's large language models, which are based on a thing called transformer models, and transformer models themselves are based on largely on neural networks, and that's a kind of AI. So what my experience was seeing the early emergence of the claims about AI and its power and so on and so forth, opening the black box, if you like, because I just was able to do that with a mathematical and computational background and going like, this is basically empty. It's like,
Yep.
or really, what it's doing is just finding patterns, it's finding correlations, which is fine. There's a whole broader body of work called machine learning, and that has its place, within a sort of certain set of constraints. But the idea that you could elevate this to a form of epistemic superiority of really knowing things because it's basically just finding patterns. So that was my real critique of the thing. That is, anybody who does like I don't know what the basic level statistics at school here would be told, don't mistake correlation for causation. It's the
Yep.
kind of basic thing you get told, and it's like that's AI is like exactly overriding those kind of distinctions. And that was really about what I'd call predictive AI, which is the first version, the classificatory AI, the thing that identifies images or tries to predict patterns for the future. Now we've got pattern synthesis, we've got generative AI, which is really just the same thing flipped around. It's just like taking those patterns and then reproducing them. But
Yep.
it's been wrapped in a bunch of interfaces that make that, allow people to make claims and make it very seductive.
Yep, yep, yep. So tell us a little bit about the kind of garbage in, garbage out, racism in, racism out kind of aspect.
Well, I think it's kind of even worse than that. It is garbage in, garbage out, which is the oldest saying in computing, which should tell you something. But it's more sort of remixed and amplified garbage out or something like that. I mean, take racism, for example, the mechanisms by which something like AI works, which is essentially sort of, segregated correlation, is actually, and this is why AI is kind of powerfully worrying or worryingly powerful in that sense, is exactly the same as the mechanism of racism itself.
Yep.
Racism itself operates on this kind of stigmatizing, segregating on the basis of superficial difference, which
Mm.
again, exactly what is happening inside the data operations of AI. So it's not so much that it's just like racist stuff in, racist stuff out. It's like AI's operations are racism,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
are misogynistic and are anthropocentric and all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're looking at aspects of that throughout the course so far. So okay.
Mhm.
Um. So yeah, tell me about what this means in terms of the notion of collateral damage.
Well, the collateral damage thing, unfortunately, has sort of, I wouldn't say it's come back to haunt me. I mean, it just seems so specifically relevant at a time when these things have now not just been weaponized, which is what I was worried about, but are actually weapons and are actually causing the thing that I took this phrase from, because collateral damage is used, mainly drawn from a military context as a way of sort of eliding really the fact that you just killed a bunch of kids and civilians in
Mm.
your so-called smart bombing campaign. That's where I took the term from, and I took it to analogize the idea that these are very, very careless technologies. You know, that they're kind of almost just to continue from the previous side, their mode of operation is very much to excise a lot of the context and meaning and try to universalize and generalize predictions or pattern generation from those models in a way that overrides, ignores, and often perverts the actual situations that people are in,
Yep.
and therefore causes harm. And I describe that as a form of collateral damage. And it comes in very specific forms in predictive AI. It comes from things like out of distribution errors, right? So, if it comes across a situation that it hasn't had any training data on, it will just essentially screw it up because it hasn't seen that data before. Very straightforward. I mean, like the stuff that happens with self-driving cars at the moment. But now with predictive AI, sorry, generative AI, we've all seen it. We've all seen the kind of nonsense that large language models come out with under the heading of so-called hallucinations, which really just they're just doing what they're told to do. It
Yep.
just becomes very obvious in some situations that that is essentially the production of bullshit, if you don't mind me saying so.
Yeah.
So, these are all very damaging if you then put them into a social situation.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. And can you tell me a little bit, like, I think it's interesting here, the kind of notion of the smoke screen, how they're used in practice.
Well, I think on a number of levels. I mean, they're used as a smokescreen most fundamentally, I think, because they claim to solve a range of wicked problems. I mean, all the way from, predicting, and then this is a serious proposition from the Ministry of Justice in the UK that by gathering enough data about children from birth, they'd be able to predict children, young people that are most likely to turn to crime or something
Mm.
like this, or
Mm.
other problems. I mean, the idea that you can predict these things is really quite dangerous,
Yep.
and the idea that these are smokescreen is because they're used as a substitute for actual solutions, which almost always involve just like more people. What we
Yep.
really need is more doctors and nurses, more teachers, and like fixing the leaking roofs in the hospitals. These are the kind of things that are actually needed, and for a variety of reasons which are too long to go into right now, but probably obvious to your students, those things are not a priority of the people who control the purse strings and are exercising control over society. But they can point to these mechanisms as a way of somehow fixing. These are forms of solutionism.
Yep. Yep. Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay. And so, how does this relate to the notion of AI violence, which is a chapter in your book?
Yeah, well, I was trying to say that it doesn't unfortunately stop at these forms of almost casual, careless violence. That really the problem with AI is so much that it resonates with and amplifies the kind of systems that we already rely on to do significant functions in society, which themselves have aspects of violence to them. And in particular, in the book, I identify strongly that tendency with bureaucratization, having so many of the same qualities that the AI itself has of distancing from the actual problem of abstracting from people's particular context, the kind of thing we talked about before. But because then of being mechanisms that decide on the distribution of goods, on the possibility people's possible life paths, as you're talking about young people's futures there a minute ago,
Yep.
these things do resolve in violence in a number of ways. And violence, I use in the book epistemic violence, meaning, if the machine says something, it doesn't matter what you say about your own life, the machine knows better.
Mhm.
Through administrative violence, which is the kind of thing that says, well, you're going to be evicted from your council home because the AI has predicted that, you're going to be antisocial or something, all the way through to actual what's largely called structural violence. So the
Yep.
intensification of misogyny and racism and marginalization, and this is even not in really getting into what's now so very clear about the relations of that AI reinforces around coloniality.
Yes, definitely. And in places like the UK and increasingly Australia, we have companies like Palantir and stuff now, like coming
Mm,
into public systems and essentially seem to be employed to do that under the notion of efficiency. But we seem to
mm.
see driven these kind of very dehumanizing and exclusionary forces through those, right? Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right. Well,
Yeah.
Palantir is at the heart of the NHS now.
Yes. Yeah. 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 And increasingly, it's being contracted in Australia as well. Yeah. And so, like this relates to kind of sociological understandings of things like social murder, and
Mm-hmm.
other kind of strong understandings of how kind of policy decisions, decide who lives and who dies. And in
Yes.
particularly in warfare, we're seeing it, currently like where there's kind of decisions made, people are killed, and then it's kind of in the collateral damage sense that you were talking about before in terms of warfare. they're then blaming the AI, aren't they, rather than the humans like using the AI to make those decisions in the first place.
Yeah, and not seeing, I think, like you said about deciding who would live and die, that's why when I was writing the book and I stumbled across the concept of necropolitics,
Yep.
it immediately rang a bell because that's what I'd see AI as just largely instantiating. And the most important thing for me, and in a way, I almost feel kind of concerned that people's immediate attention on AI as being enrolled in things that are clearly awful, like civilian bombing campaigns, might actually in some way, because of its shockingness distract people's attention from the fact this again is really just a continuity of what AI is doing on a much more prosaic level, and
Mm.
of course, that is dreadful, and the things that AI is doing as it permeates society more broadly on a sort of microsocial level, it's doing a very similar thing all the time. It's
Yes.
just doing it at maybe slower, maybe at a lower level, but it's to me, I would describe it all as largely a mechanism of necropolitics.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, that's another concept we have looked at throughout the course as well. That's great. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And we have this notion here of
Oh,
necropop.
funny
So,
enough,
yeah, funnily enough.
nice
So,
segue.
yeah. So, can you give me some examples of this?
Well, I think talking about the sort of pervasive social examples, the kind of things that were more extant when I was writing the book would be, the adoption of AI in health context. Now, the American situation is specific because, although it's like largely the same as the UK one now, because it is so financialized, but that also makes it very obvious that decisions were already at that point, this is several years ago, being made to discontinue people's end of life care on the basis of predicting how quickly they could get to do that, how
Yep.
quickly they could optimize not paying. And this is a kind of paradigm for me of how, if really, it's a means of legitimizing.
Mm.
This is very similar to the point you made a minute ago about the warfare. It's really just it's a means of legitimizing things that are already taking place, that are already in the in the interest of the institutions and forces that are deploying these technologies. That allows them to legitimize decisions that we might otherwise object to, and make them opaque,
Mm.
and but also amplify, scale, and accelerate them. So it's not again, really, sort of on my hobby horse, not really doing anything new in that sense. The fundamental misunderstanding of AI to me would be the idea that it is somehow, beamed back from the future and is something incredibly different. It's not really doing anything new. It is a real material mechanism. It does computation, and as we can see, has significant material requirements in order to do that. But what it's really doing is just legitimizing a lot of things already happening, and those things are largely to do with the disposability of various people. I mean, my interest at the moment, I'm writing a chapter about disability justice and AI, and that is very, very clear how the values that are mobilized around AI, you mentioned efficiency, are about efficiency, productivity, social usefulness, in the sense of how much you contribute to the economy. And if you don't, then you're not useful. You're
Yep.
not relevant, and you are basically disposable.
Yep. 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 Okay. So, um, in the second half of the book, you kind of move towards maybe way things could be.
Mhm.
Kind of post-machining. Can you talk about decomputing a little bit? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So in the book, I was, writing at a time when, believe it or not, a large part of the justification for AI was that it had scientific authority, or at
Yes.
least providing objectivity, and that in some ways has moved on.
Mm.
Really now it's kind of interesting time right now because we're told, it's very clear to everybody that this is an extremely unreliable technology at best, and yet we're still being told that it is incredibly inevitable. But that's just like stands on its own terms. It's just inevitable to just get used to it,
Mm.
rather than before where it was, well, this is inevitable because it's a continuity of scientific progress. I
Yep.
think progress is still latent under the justification for it. But I was really just using, I was trying to say how important it is to be able to draw on critical perspectives that are again already there. It's not a really reason to, we don't need to invent a new field actually of AI critique, because things that are important for AI critique, such as feminist perspectives, feminist critiques of our existing knowledge structures, our existing structures of authority, decolonial critiques. These are all actually the most relevant things when
Yep.
it comes to AI. And even now, when you can't move for sort of academic studies of how cognitive offloading is ruining education because of how AI is being enrolled in it. Again, I'd be flipping it around and saying, well, we've got concepts like critical pedagogy, which are actually important both to question the inevitability of AI, but also just important because actually that's a better way to do thinking.
Yes. Yeah, 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 yeah. And I think we've looked at the studies. I think it was at Columbia or NYU, with did those tests with the students, the cognitive offloading thing, where after a year, the ones that were using AI the most were, least cognitively cognitively developed. Um, it's interesting to me though, like as an aside here, there's like, yeah, it seems to be that people are realizing it's unreliable, it's damaging,
Mm.
yet more and more people are using it. Um, what's with that juxtaposition, do you think?
Yes, I mean, juxtaposition exactly right. I see AI most profoundly at the moment as useful as examined as a contradiction or a set of contradictions. I think there's a lot of things going on. I think chat, for example, as an interface is almost it's a crime actually to have created that because it taps into so many things that people will make use of. First off to infer that there's actually some kind of embodied mind behind it because that's the only conversations we've ever had before.
Mm,
Also because we're in societies that are cut through by isolation and loneliness
yeah.
and already existing vast amounts of mental health problems. So having this thing that you can apparently confide in, that you can ask for advice, of course, this is seductive. At the same time, I don't think we should overread the popularity. When I'm on lots of signal groups with, well, several signal groups with people who are, engineers, software engineers, and just constantly talk about how they're being literally forced to use these tools, which they
Yeah.
don't believe in because the management think they should be using it to the point that they're getting measured for using it. And it's the same thing in management consultants are being measured on their performance about how much AI they're using. It's being forced into everyone's lives. So I don't know how much it's being used is necessarily a proxy for how popular it is. And clearly amongst young people, I don't know if this would be the case with anybody who's listening to this, but I understand from a great distance to being young, that among young people, AI is quite often considered to be very lame,
Yes.
for my opinion, for very good reasons, right? So I don't think we should overemphasize its pervasiveness is not the same as its popularity.
Yeah, there's in the workshops we've done on some AI stuff, there's an ambivalence about it, deep ambivalence, deep suspicion,
Hmm.
that it's troubling, that it's damaging, but there's also this kind of we kind of need to get to know it under the kind of
Hmm.
discourse that it's kind of going to be important in the future. It is being rammed down our throats. We need to know how to use it. So this is kind
Mm.
of yeah, very much ambivalence in the research we've done so far. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
I mean, if I could offer a small word of, obviously partisan reassurance to people, this stuff is not the future. So,
Yeah.
like, don't worry.
Yeah, 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 that's right. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so can you tell us a little
Oh,
bit
nice,
more?
nice picture.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The people. So one thing I'm really interested in to kind of as we move towards the end of our chat is that you have very specific and kind of doable answers to how we can, engage with these kind of being forced down our throats. And you talk about
Mm.
decomputing. You very much, I think, importantly point out the kind of fascist undertones or
Mm.
essentially basis of these technologies. Can
Mm.
you tell us a little bit about how we should tackle these things?
Yeah, I mean, the approach I took in the book, and really I'm still taking, although it's has some nuances now because of the way generative AI has evolved, is essentially just to try and flip the script, really, just to say, well, what are the key characteristics of these technologies and the social relations they reinforce, and what would be the other to that, or rather, what is the other to that? What are the historical, contemporary, social examples of people doing different things differently, and
Mm,
how have they done those things? And what I use the term people's councils not because I'm trying to create something, but because I observe that that's something that emerges when people really need to do, when people realize that, as it were, nobody's coming to save them, that there is no actual answer to the problems that they have, and that the things that are being
mm,
presented for answers, AI, for example, are actually making things worse, and that there's a need to do things differently, but also that the way of doing things differently, this way of doing things differently, which is collectively, is a way of also addressing some of the harms that have already been done. That's why I also draw on the idea of critical pedagogy because
yep.
we need to reestablish trust and relationality with each other. We need to re-recognize, that in a way our mutual vulnerability is what draws us together, but is also our strength because together we can act on those things. So, in all these reasons, the reasons of inverting the abstracting and reductive epistemologies from AI, to me, emerge as the form that is also quite present in actually in everyday life, definitely in any form of crisis situation or any form of historical moment of opportunity has always been something like this, the assembly form of the People's Council, whatever you want to call it.
Mm.
And I think that's a healthy thing, but it's also, as you so kindly said, actually a very accessible thing because all it really means is, I mean, a contemporary example would be parents at the school gate, who have heard
Yep.
that the school is introducing AI and, maybe thinking, oh, I don't know, that's probably good for my kids' job prospects. That would, in my opinion, not be the case. But they're also really worried because they've heard about kids having conversations with,
Yeah.
self-harm on. So, that is itself the collective formation of a group of people who are just going, I think we need to do something about this.
Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, yeah, it's people shouldn't just kind of lay down and take it. We need to kind of,
Yeah.
get involved at the kind of everyday, mundane level, in small institutions and community
Yeah.
basis to be able to kind of do something about it at each place this is kind of happening. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think what decomputing would add a couple of aspects to that, but one of the specific things would be that AI itself is like a diagnostic. Wherever AI is being proposed as a solution, whether it's in education or healthcare or wherever you want to think about it, actually what it's saying to us is there's already a problem.
Yeah.
It would be incredible if you had a real education system that wasn't based on metrics, that wasn't based on mass numbers, that wasn't based on reductive throughputs, to consider one of these tools as having anything to do with education. So what you're really doing is by saying, okay, we're not just opposing AI. What we're doing is saying, wait a minute, what's already gone wrong?
Yeah.
That we are
Yeah.
reduced to a situation where we're actually seeing AI as a potential answer.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks. Okay. Um, and yeah, so I mentioned already that you
Mm.
talk about this needs to through the lens of fascism. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about that?
Well, I think it's one of those things where you kind of like hate to be wearing the "I told you so" T-shirt or whatever, but it's really clear
Mm,
now that the ethos and worldview and interest that are propagated by the people who've introduced AI in society entirely overlap with people whose interests and politics are authoritarian and reactionary, far right,
yeah.
and in a lot of cases overtly fascist. But I think what I was trying to draw attention to was it's not really just the sort of figureheads or the characters or even necessarily the politics, but the fact that that you can never separate technology and value. You never separate technology and meaning. You technologies are invested with meanings as they are created through the concepts and mechanisms which create them, and then go on to reshape and reinforce and possibly change those values in society as they're widely deployed. It's not a one-to-one. It's not like a deterministic thing. It's not,
Mm,
that you have this technology. I don't ever describe, at least just check the slide, I should check it, but I don't think I say AI is fascist because fascism is a political modality. But what I do say is that AI as a form of technology or as a form of technopolitics facilitates fascistic forms of solutionism. So
yeah.
at the very least, forms of solutionism that are based on a eugenicist actually predisposition towards excluding people, radical forms of exclusion, states of exception that regard people as lives are not worth supporting anymore. That's like what what was I don't remember the Nazi phrase, but like lives unworthy of life. I can't remember the German now,
Mhm.
but that actually this is the kind of tendency that is that AI leans into,
Yeah.
and actually equally sort of clear for me does nothing in the opposite direction. So I feel very clearly, I feel very comfortable saying that the particular kind of AI we've got at the moment is only really going to further this kind of formation in society one way or the other, whether it's through necropolitics and collateral damage and well basically explicitly eugenicist agendas, which again which is not from AI. That's really also my point. It's not that AI is causing eugenics to make a comeback. Eugenics never went away, but
Yeah.
in the world that we're living in, eugenics is making a comeback, and I think pretty big time because the forces that are so invested are not prepared to think of other solutions to the problems that we have. And AI is very ready-made to facilitate that, and almost impossible to my mind to turn to the alternative.
Yeah. Okay. And to conclude, yeah. So can you kind of maybe sum up and also leaning towards the future, more like leaning towards the future? Where do you think
Yeah.
where are we going?
Well, we are going to hell in a handbasket in the kind of phrase, but that's not inevitable either, right? Nothing
Yeah.
about this is inevitable. That's the basic point, and this is another strong correlation between fascistic politics and AI as a technology assemblage. Is both of these things try to tell you they're inevitable, and actually most of them are trying to tell you they're inevitable at the point of their greatest vulnerability. And I think that's also true of AI is in a massively vulnerable position at the moment because it's really clear that it can't exist without these huge, impossible to satisfy financial and material resource demands and everything else. And so it's very vulnerable, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
I think where we're going is really the need for imaginaries of alternative technopolitics. So we can't get away from technology. I don't believe in this kind of, oh, we need to reclaim our humanity from technology. I mean, fine, but actually humans have never existed without technologies. But we do need to think about how we develop technologies that are in lines with the values, social values that we want. And I think decomputing, the thing that I tried to talk about at the moment, is because I follow on from the book, is trying to articulate ways of looking at that. So the generative AI angle there particularly would be that I would associate decomputing as forms of computing that are aligned with the ideas of degrowth. So it's trying to escape this thing that you see very clearly in AI, the infinite growth, the infinite lines must go up, the infinite resource consumption, the expansion, which after all was really behind the idea of empire in the first place. So, that it has degrowth, that it has this de-automatization, it has this removal of our distancing and alienated social relations, but more positively looking at what technologies that support care, technologies that infrastructure the common good. Why is it that data centers can steal all the electricity and water from communities? Is not just a question of like the data center is a bad thing, which in my opinion it is, but it's like who controls those things in the first place? Why aren't those things under the social, under the common social control? Why don't we re-socialize important common good resources and find technological or artificial artifices, forms of
Yeah.
artifice, forms of artifact that can help us to maintain those things as common goods?
Yeah. I think that's a great way to conclude. Excellent. Yeah. So
Great.
thanks so much for joining us, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.